Welcome to the Men on the Bus podcast series episode 2. Today we will explore the fairy tale, Snow White, in the light of Jungian thought, with our special guest Stephen Flynn.
Let's have a look so we can see it. That one there. That's a Celtic cross, has many meanings, and I'm just going to use one from illustration. That cross, I shall use that a bit of paper here for the moment. That cross there, this is the full aspect of any human being. It's total. It could be a city, the North Gate, South Gate, East Gate, West Gate of a city. And it could be anything, but I'm going to use it to say that this illustration is the masculine and the feminine within a person. You have the positive masculine, positive feminine, the negative masculine, and the negative feminine. And all that is complete within every person. And we are both male and female, and whatever dominates is what we manifest. And Jung said something very interesting that in terms of this talk, that the child is the brain of the child is likened to two large rivers, which are filled with impressions as the child grows up of the masculine energy and the feminine energy. And this fills up the child. So the child then starts to learn the sophistication of manhood and womanhood as the child progresses. And if we look at this tragedy of Snow White, same as Jack and the Beanstalk, ironically, he had no dad, and this young lady has no woman and no mother, because on giving birth, she died. And she imaged Snow White, that's how she got the name, and it's Snowdrop in some of the old stories of it, which were written in the 19th century. And this is where I got most of the story that I'm using. She was called Snowdrop or Snow White, and it's even known out as far as Africa. So this particular story has it that mother imaged this child with black hair, with white skin, with red cheeks, and while she was imaging this, it all came about because she pricked a finger and the blood dropped onto the snow, and she saw the contrast of the red blood and the white. And being pregnant, she then imaged her child, and it was set in a setting of the windowsill, which was black. So you had these three colours representing Snow White. So she ended up with black hair and lovely white skin and red cheeks, and that's our Snow White. Now, what happened is when she died, father, the only mention of father is half a sentence in the story. After a few months, father married again. End of father. He didn't seem to have any more say or influence in the life of the child. And maybe this epitomizes the fact that the child grew up with no protection from father, with no guidance from father. He just wasn't there for her. And so the masculine learning and energy that she needed was absent. And so she wasn't able to continue her development normally, because she didn't have a mother, and father may as well have been dead as well. But anyway, he wasn't. He was the first kind of man within the story of 10 men and the story of 3 women. So we have 1 woman already gone from the story. And then we have him marrying again, and by all accounts, marrying this woman who was preoccupied with her own image. And when the little girl was 7, the image of the magic mirror was magic, because the mirror, when you looked into the mirror, you saw your true self, and you are but a reflection of yourself looking into the mirror and seeing your true self. So the mirror was magic in that sense. So when she looked into the mirror, she was told that there was a little girl who was better looking than her. Now, to make sense of it, what if this little girl and the wicked stepmother was one and the same? And if that was so, then the little girl had a very preoccupation with her own image and lacking any depth. But she was only a little girl of 7. She knew nothing of father and certainly had no mother except for this woman who wasn't friendly and who was always in competition with her, even as a child. So that was the first man and the first part of her development of the first 7 years. The second man comes in, who's the hunter or the woodcutter, and he is asked to take her away, kill her in the forest, and return with the child's heart, so that to ensure that he'd fulfilled the task requested. This was, of course, a queen, allegedly. She was an upstart because the little girl was a princess, or going to be a queen one day. But that was the royalty, so she had a lot of power and a lot of money. So the hunter went off with this little girl, aged 7, and he's the second kind of man. He couldn't do any harm, but he couldn't support or wouldn't support. And he was cute. He went back to the queen and said he'd done the job, where in actual fact, he'd left her deep in the forest where she couldn't come back herself, lost, because he didn't want her to reappear. And he killed a deer and took the heart and presented it to the wicked stepmother and said, look, the child is now dead. So that she thought was the end of it. And in the meantime, this little girl, who had spoken for the first time to a man in the story and thanked him sweetly before they parted. And then she wandered and wandered around for a long, long time. Her feet were very sore with traveling through the wood. And eventually she came across the third males, and they were 7 dwarves. And it's only of late they've been given personalities. But originally they were just 7 dwarves who went off into the hills digging for precious stones. Collectively, the old song, "I ho, it's off to work we go." But that's an added. And so they let this child in from the middle of nowhere, not questioning anything, simply saying to her, well, if you tidy up in the house, you can stay. You do your bit, and we do ours. And these 7 men were only half size, reflecting the fact that they weren't fully grown men in that setting. And they were aware, they were conscious, but they weren't caring for her, nor did they want to know her origin or what happened to her, as this stranger appeared. So they had an agreement. And that's kind of the majority of relationships. You do the cooking and I go out and do this, or you do that and I do the other, and it's a kind of an arrangement men have with women. That's the majority of us. And so she worked away on that basis. Then the magic mirror told the wicked princess that this girl was still alive and she was more beautiful than her. So she found out where she was and attempted to kill her. Attempted to kill her 3 times in all. The final 4th time, because she'd already attempted once, the final 4th time she thought she had actually killed her. And the process of doing so, first time she went into the house and wrapped something around her body and almost and choked, in effect, the child couldn't breathe, fell to the floor, and she thought she'd killed her and went off. And the dwarves came back, saw her, and brought her back again, rehabilitated her, released her from this wrap round of the body where she couldn't hardly breathe, and she was able to revive and survive. And they told her not to let anybody else in the house. And so the wicked stepmother disguised herself and went back again. So we've got this story of accumulating the relationship between the wicked stepmother, who has to deceive Snow White each time she approached. And imagine this as the ego of this little girl. She's had no understanding of a good woman, no understanding of a good man, and she's developing, and she's no one to look to as a role model. And so she's beginning to fall back within herself to try and look good and please. But there's a part of her within herself which is undeveloped. And as far as she's concerned, she wants to get rid of that because it's of no use, of no benefit. With this infant relationship, this infantile ego that hasn't got any knowledge of being responsible, standing up for herself, and she's immature. So this is the kind of development of this young lady as she starts to grow up. And so there's a kind of a mutual hate within herself, and she wants to present and deceive with her presentation, because if her husband was to see what she was really like, the husband would get rid of her, or everything would be disclosed. So she's in a bit of a state within. Now, she went again. She came back to the house again, attempting to kill the child, and wouldn't let her in. The little girl wouldn't let her into the house because the dwarves had said, "Don't let anybody in." None of them stayed back to look after her or protect her, knowing that she'd already, a murder had already been attempted by some stranger, and the stepmother had to disguise herself again. So it's almost like if this was to go on internally, it's almost as though this external part of her that's developing very negatively is going back to her own inner self, her own positive self, in some kind of disguise, and trying to get rid of it. It's almost like a suicidal attempt, because if the inner child were to die, then what would be left of the child? What would be left of the person? It would be, you can't have one half of you dying without the other half being affected. Anyway, on the second attempt of using a comb, or the third attempt, literally, of using a comb and with poison at the end of it, so that when she opened the window and stuck her head out, this disguised wicked stepmother was able to attempt to kill her again, and she fell again into the house, and the dwarves came back and pulled away the comb and managed to revive her. But they still went off and told her not to open the windows and not to open the door. So they were at this lack of protection, lack of security for her. So they just said, "Don't open the windows, don't open the doors." And the child had been attempted to be killed again. So off they went to work, working the depths into precious stones, trying to earn a living, which was priority, to the detriment of anything else. And then the third time, of course, was the apple. So it was left on the step, so that Snow White had to wait till this strange woman who left the apple on the step, and then she couldn't even recognize who she was either. Very naive. And naivety for a young man or a young woman, they haven't got the depth and breadth of understanding, the wit, the wisdom that life gives us. And once you learn that, you can't go back to innocence. And this little girl was innocent. But one part of her was pretending to be hard and wise and cute and deceptive, very deceptive. So yes, the apple lodged in the child's mouth, and as far as the little dwarves came back, and as far as they were concerned, she was dead. So they then put her in this allegedly glass coffin, but left her lying there in grace. And then came the 10th man, as it were, the fourth male influence, and he was able to marry her. He took her away and fell in love with her. He wanted to protect her, and she was able to get back that which was hers, which was the land, the very land that the dwarves dwelt on, the forest itself, the mountains they were digging in. That was all her domain. So she was able to get back what belonged to her. And that negative part of, let's say, herself, went to a point where she was invited to the wedding and danced herself to the point where she danced and killed and died in the shoes. Or if you like, she danced herself within the wedding to the point where she was no longer a threat. And this part of the story means that that part of the young girl was able to develop through the experience of the four types of men that she encountered in her journey in life. So this 10th man who offered her security, who offered her the ability to become what she was born to be, and become perhaps a mother herself and embrace womanhood in all its facets. So when I showed you this here, what was happening to this young lady, she was able to meet the positive masculine in full flurry, in fullness, but it took a while for her to work through the various aspects of manhood and the negative aspects of manhood, which is neglect and not caring, because it's very common for men not to care. And it's more common for men to say, right, you do this and I'll do that. Fair, that's fair enough. And then you had the negative side of the feminine, which was expressed in this wicked stepmother, and the positive side of the feminine, which was totally absent in her. She hadn't any reference to that. She had to learn it, because it appears when this starts to get fulfilled and grow, this is reflected. The masculine and the feminine are reflected. You can't have one growing within oneself without the other growing. So in a relationship between a man and a woman, the man has to learn about womanhood through her. She is the queen of the house, and the man is the king of the road, all things being normal, because there are different expressions of these energies. They don't lend themselves to any particular pattern, although they're identifiable. But we all have them, no matter what road we take with the use of our gender, or it still needs to be fulfilled, that we learn about the masculine and the feminine within ourselves through others. So that if we are very strong masculine, then we have, by definition, a weak feminine, and vice versa. And so for me, for instance, in marriage now, in my later life, I need to learn that from the queen of the house about the feminine, and she learns from the king of the road about the masculine. And so we begin to fulfill ourselves through each other, through the positive relationship that a long marriage is needed if it's going to be sustained. And that really brings us round, except to say, I have another pattern here. This one is it's very ancient again. It's one that can be found in ancient Ireland, from ancient Ireland, and it's almost all over the world. So it's got many meanings. So look at this particular interpretation. The coil. If you start to reflect and go back as a person and look at what happened to you and dwell in what happened. Look, my mother died when I was born, and I had to go and marry a man, for instance, and deceive him by showing him how beautiful I was. And I didn't feel satisfied. He didn't recognize who I was. He didn't even care. And all he wanted was a fancy woman. That would be her story as she went back in time. And she could dwell back in time and go right back to the beginning. So that remains static. And she goes back in time and becomes somewhat depressed. Or she can go forward in life and extend this and even form another circle here of a life that is woven differently and becomes interesting and extend. And if she has a child, maybe there's a third coil of how it was, from being a deprived little girl to getting married and relating to a man worthy of knowing, and then having a child. So you've got these three coils developing. And that would be one of the definitions of many of that particular. And another possibility here is, just look at this, you could say, here, how would that be? Let's say the father is at the top here, the purposes of the mother at the bottom, and the ancient Irish symbol of the whole, she holds everything together. It's been illustrated by a stone worn down to form a little cup shape, and then within it there's water, and that's like the womb it contains. What does it contain? The man says, this is where we're going, and then she will say, well, is this it? Is this where we are? Is this where you've taken us? And so she has to make a nest of it. And then you have the daughter here who said, why? I know where we're going, Dad, but why are we going there, Dad? And is this it when we get there? And then the son over here says, I know how to get there, Dad. We go this way, we go that way. We can go by car, we can go by bus, we can go cheapers, we can walk, we can hitchhike, we can do all manners. That's the way to go, and this is the route we should take. So the masculine energy here can resort to how, which is intellect. He can go down to look at, because that's his domain. He can go and have a look at why, and that's the north, and that's the east and west of him. And the mother, the south of her, can go up again and look at, is this it? Let's look at the facts of being this. This room is too small, the house is too late, we're too far away from the shops, and so on. So she can look at the facts of the situation, and then she can look at why. Well, I can see why we've moved here, because it is safer, and through there are neighbours, so she would evaluate. And also money is around evaluation. So the here and now of the feminine energy, including and you get the yin and yang here, including the value of something. And the masculine can embrace that, but he can't travel north-south. And she can't travel south-north. And when I worked with a lot of people, women in particular took their dwelling and tried to accepted the unacceptable, which was some of the story of Snow White if she'd have remained where she was and not moved on. Accepting the unacceptable because afraid of moving, because that's not her energy. So she knows why she's staying and probably a little bit of how she might move, but she hasn't got the masculine energy of I'm going now. And it's only when these two are embraced within oneself do you become whole. How's that?
Great.
How was that?
Very good.
Josh?
Very good.
Okay, so those are the kind of things that the story unfolds. And that's the journey that an individual has to make if they haven't got any good examples of manhood and womanhood to rely on. They have to find it, and it's a longer journey, and they might stop at any point and remain at that point in their lives, unfulfilled, bitter, inadequately developed, and they have to learn eventually to accept. Now, when, for instance, the innocent child accepts and dominates the negative part of herself, that becomes wisdom. She no longer go back to innocence, which is an element of stupidity, sadly. The innocence, once it's broken, then she needs the shadow part of herself for the wisdom, for the being cute, for being aware. And if she doesn't embrace, because the other way it can go on, if she doesn't embrace her own negativity, she remains aloof and all lovely and sweet and naive. that can also happen in the psyche, where in fact we have to own our shadow and be aware that there is this, when it comes to the male, for instance, he has to own the fact that he could be a bastard in his behavior, and it's within him. And if he hasn't accepted that and mastered it so that it's not dominant anymore, otherwise he becomes what he probably didn't choose to become. He found himself living, and if this was a city, we could turn around and say, a city will include, people with poverty, will include difficulties. But if the management of the city, the parliament of it, if it doesn't address the dark quarters and try and infiltrate the dark quarters with goodness, the dark quarters would overcome the rest of the city, and the city would become unmanageable and not a place to live at all. It become unlivable. And so with ourselves, we too could become unlivable within, or unlivable with, because of our adverse bias, undeveloped bias that we've ended up being. There we are.